An interesting comment I see pop up online is that certain card games on the market feel more like board games. I've seen this apply to Altered, which I play, and Riftbound, which I'm interested in playing once it comes out. When attempting to interact with this comment, the discussion can quickly devolve into matters of taxonomy. Are card games board games? Are all card games board games? Does it matter if they are? And it's not a very interesting discussion to have, so we will bypass it entirely here. Instead, we're gonna steelman the position that yes, certain card games on the market do feel more like board games. And we're gonna see where that feeling stems from, what aspects of the design of these games make it more likely, and possibly learn a bit about cognitive science in the meantime. So as I mentioned, two games that I've seen garner a lot of these board gamey allegations are Altered and Riftbound. And to be fair, there have been attempts online to dissect that feeling and connect it to specific design choices. For example, Riftbound has players accumulating victory points, and those are marked by sliding a counter along a track. That's something that happens a lot in board games, and not something one does too often in card games. So when I see that, I'm likely to think that it's inspired by the media where I've seen it before, and that's going to be board games. To give you another example, and one that I think is by far the biggest contributor, also one that's escaped the scrutiny of Reddit thus far, I think at least, is that both Riftbound and Altered have multiple battlefields, and you can choose where to commit your units. As a footnote, Marvel Snap has also utilized a similar system, heavily inspired by board games like Smash Up and Erland and Sea, but it hasn't contributed as much to it being viewed as board gamey. It pops up occasionally in the wider discourse, but not to the same extent. I feel like that might be due to it being very digital first in its mechanics design. Lots of card effects that would be difficult to emulate in a paper format are present in it. So any board game influences are well camouflaged under that prominent feeling of video gaminess. The game already feels video gamey, so that hides any traces of it feeling board gamey. Even outside of those two titles plus Marvel Snap, having multiple zones is a common thing between both card and board games, but in card games, these are mostly rules-based. Played cards go to the battlefield, dead cards go to the graveyard, unplayed but drawn cards go to the hand, and so on and so forth. But you don't really get to choose where your cards go. Having to choose where to commit units is recognizably, at least to me, a board game decision to make. There's a semi-facetious name for a board game subgenre called dudes on a map, where the main decision-making process is deciding where on the map the dudes will go. Same with worker placement, probably a top 5 popularity mechanic in board games if I were to hazard a guess, all about deciding where to put your workers. Altered cements the where being important even further by having pieces move between spaces on the tracks, something firmly associated with board games also. It would be more board gamey only if you rolled to see how many spaces you get to move. So board games ask you where you want to play your stuff, card games usually don't ask you that. Board games have victory points and trackers for them, and card games don't. So, case closed, right? Unless we were to go a little bit deeper. On a common sense level, I think it's non-controversial to say that yes, some of those traits are associated with board games more than card games, so a game that has more of these starts to resemble a board game. But we could ask some very interesting follow-up questions here, like why does including board game elements move the game's classification towards board game, while the same game having flavor text doesn't move it towards literature, or having League of Legends characters appear on cards towards video games? Those are obviously nonsensical on a common sense level, but why is that the case? Also, how can we both agree that these are still in the card game category, but also kind of less so than other card games? Is there a scale or metric that makes a card game card gamey? Does them being board gamey make them less card gamey? Is it a zero-sum game of some sort? To answer these questions, we're gonna need to get a bit philosophical, and I'm very happy to announce that after promising it years ago, this is finally my chance to bring Wittgenstein into card games. Now, back to the topic. A core question of cognitive science is how do we know what concept or category to apply to something, especially if it's something that we haven't seen before. And it's an interesting one because it starts off easy. If I'm shown what looks to be a board game, I understand it to be a board game. But it gets more and more difficult as we try to understand the process in detail, answering the question of why do I feel like something I'm seeing for the first time looks like a board game. Early approaches to the idea are referred to as classical or Aristotelian after the Greek philosopher. They outlived Aristotle by a lot though, through the Middle Ages surviving in some form all the way into modernity. Like, if you asked around, there is probably somebody who subscribes to the classical view of categories still. And this system follows three assumptions. The first is that a category, like board games, is a list of necessary and sufficient features. And those are capital letter words here, by the way. Confusingly, not the exact same as necessity and sufficiency in formal logic, but don't worry, I'm gonna give you a couple examples that are 95% accurate and quite easy to follow, I think. A board game is a form of play structured by rules played on a board, is a necessary and sufficient feature. It is sufficient because if we see someone doing what's described, we know that they are playing a board game. It is also necessary because if we take away an element, like it being structured by rules, the activity would no longer be a board game. It would be a free-form RPG, perhaps. By the way, this feature might be sufficient and necessary, but not necessarily a good one, depending on your views on boardless board games, for example. Like, it might not be a good reflection of reality. A real attempt at crafting a definition of board games would probably be a list of necessary features that become sufficient together. A feature that's necessary but not sufficient in this example would be a board game has pieces that players move. It's hard to imagine a board game with that element removed, so it is necessary, but just having movable pieces doesn't make something a board game, so it's necessary, as in you can't have a board game without it, but not sufficient, meaning you won't make a board game with just it. For completion's sake, let's do sufficient but not necessary. A good example for this is something that applies to a subset of board games. A board game involves moving pieces on a chessboard, is an example. If we see someone doing that, it is very probably a board game, unless there's some niche sport that I'm not familiar with. But there are board games that are not played on a chessboard. So it's enough to make a board game, it's sufficient, but you can make a board game without it, so it's not necessary. The second assumption is that those categories have to have clearly defined boundaries. There cannot be elements that kinda belong into a category. It's either in or out, no in between. And the third is that all members have to have the same status within the category. So within the category of card games, there are none that would be more of a card game or less of a card game than others. Now, our prior discussions of Altered and Riftbound shed some light on the limitations of this model. We did, after all, discuss feelings of partially belonging to categories. It's pretty clear that to players who hold these beliefs, these games either belong on the fringes of the card game category, or belong to it fully, but less so than some more typical examples. So we are looking at a phenomenon that's hard to unite with the assumption of clear boundaries, the assumption of same within category status, or both. Unfortunately, these limitations have been recognized by people who don't spend their time reading Reddit comments about Riftbound, among others, a gentleman by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein. We're gonna fast forward through his life to the point at which he becomes relevant to our topic. So he was born, then he died, then his manuscripts got published, and it turns out parts of one of them are about concepts, categories, and the formation thereof. Wittgenstein argued that members within a category don't have one certain underlying characteristic. There is no card gaminess or board gaminess, but it's a series of overlapping similarities that not all of them have to share. Fortuitously, he also used games as his example, allowing us to stick to that one as well. Wittgenstein invites the reader of his philosophical investigations to examine the very general category of all games, including card, board, ball, and Olympic. Much to my satisfaction, he notes what we already intuitively understand as commonalities and differences between card and board games, though I doubt he was referring to Magic the Gathering here. To quote, "Now past to card games, here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out and others appear." In his own words, he could find no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. He then compares these to resemblances in appearance and character between family members: build, eye color, gait, and temperament. They may overlap and crisscross, there's definitely something there, but it's unlikely that there's going to be a single family belonging through line across all members. And since the families may also overlap, it gives us a nice framework to talk about games on the border between two categories. Marvel's Midnight Suns or Cultist Simulator are video games with enough card game DNA to partially belong to the card game family. But their core gameplay, for example one relying heavily on freeform targeting, or the other relying on real-time timers running in parallel, and of course ignoring the obvious ones like the fact that they are both played on a computer, those plant them firmly in the video game category, so they are card-gamey video games. Coming back to our topic, Riftbound and Altered inherit most of their appearance and character from card games. You play cards representing permanent units or temporary spells or tactical maneuvers, your units have stats, you draw new cards from a deck you constructed before the match, and a million other similarities. But they also inherit other traits, the victory points, the battlefield choices, from the board game family. So we can perceive them as a member of both, though to varying degree based on the number and prominence of these inherited traits. But we can go even further, specifically another 20 years or so into the future, when Eleanor Roche defined the term prototype in a psycholinguistic sense in her study Natural Categories. Heavily inspired by Wittgenstein's families, she posited the following. Each concept, like card game, has a single real-world example that's the best example of it for each person. It's the first one that comes to mind when asked to name a card game. I'd hazard a guess that for a lot of people, including myself, that's probably going to be Magic the Gathering. A scientifically important addition to this is that prototypicality can be measured in experiments. One approach to that is measuring response time. Prototypical members are recognized as part of a category much more quickly. If I were to show you Falkor from the Neverending Story, it will probably take you a bit longer to mark that you were just shown a dog than if I were to show you a Dachshund, which is kind of an unhinged name to have for a dog that looks like this, by the way. In Poland, we call those jamnik, which I think is far more suitable. The other is exemplar naming. You ask people to give a couple examples of dog, and then measure how many wrote down husky compared to Falkor. If, as expected, husky comes more often, that means it's more prototypical, either the prototype or closer to the prototype. Categories are formed around this prototype according to two assumptions. First, to maximize the number of traits shared with the prototype, and secondly, to minimize the number of attributes shared with other categories, kind of treating necessity and sufficiency that we've discussed previously as a scale rather than a yes-no question. And this finally gives us a scale to measure our feelings of card and board gaminess. If we assume, let's say, Magic the Gathering to be the prototype, games that share more traits with it are going to be closer to the prototype, while games that borrow from other categories or share less with Magic the Gathering are going to be farther away. Imagine, if you will, each category is kind of a magnet that pulls on certain attributes. Altered and Riftbound are going to be pulled towards MTG by the attributes of having an alternating turn structure, cards representing units or creatures, cards having numerical stats representing their prowess, etc. But they are also being pulled towards the prototypical board game, whatever it might be, by the attributes of having variable zones for the players to play cards in, or having movement across spaces, or having victory points. and as such, they might end up farther from the prototypical card game than a game like Pokemon, which shares an equal or a similar number of characteristics with the card game prototype, but shares less attributes with the board game category. The board game magnet is pulling more strongly on Riftbound than it is on Pokemon. And this also sheds some light on why these titles might feel like board games, but not necessarily like video games or literature. The combined magnet that is the tabletop gaming category has many more traits to pull on than the magnet of video games or the magnet of literature. Thus, Riftbound is staying firmly in the tabletop games category, and upon zooming in, we can see the discussion that we've been having here. Where in that category does it belong? Is it more of a card game? Is it more of a board game? Now, for implementation purposes, we could of course discuss which traits are core to which category. What's a board game trait? What's a card game trait? What's both? And for that purpose, I would recommend the following exercise. Look to pop culture for examples of fictitious card and board games, and see what elements of their gameplay are portrayed. Since these have to be understood by audiences largely unfamiliar with these categories, I reckon that they are boiled down to their most distinct or prototypical attributes. So comparing and contrasting Big Bang Theory's Mystic Warlords of Ka versus Parks and Rec's Cones of Dunshire might be a window into what the public perception of card and board game prototypical traits are. So in summation, the next time we see a new CCG being called board gamey, let's skip the boring taxonomy discussion of whether a card game is a board game and jump straight into Wittgenstein. I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed. A special thanks to the patrons who make videos like this possible, especially Dillinger, Ola Brynner, and Maciej Majka. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.